The U.S. Senate just revealed a huge gold market threat. A handful of senators from both political parties just put their names on a bill that most Americans have never heard of. But buried inside it is a warning about something the financial world has quietly known for decades and never wanted to say out loud. Almost every ounce of exchange-approved gold and silver in this country sits within 180 miles of a single city. One city, one point of failure. And now, Washington is calling it a matter of national security. Not a headline, not a rumor, a bill in Congress right now. So the question is no longer if this vulnerability exists. It's what happens the day it's finally tested. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why that day may be closer than anyone in Washington is willing to admit. If you're new here, welcome to Currency Insight. This is exactly the kind of story we live for. The ones hiding in plain sight and plain government documents that most people simply scroll past. And if you're someone who's been around a while, who remembers what the dollar used to be worth, who's watched a few of these cycles come and go, then you already know this channel is for you. So do an old friend a favor, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it means everything to us. Now tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from today? We'd genuinely love to know, and with that, let's get into it. For decades, the American precious metals market has carried a secret that almost no one outside the industry ever talked about. It is not a secret in the sense that it was hidden on purpose. It was simply ignored, because for a long time, nobody thought it mattered. But now, a small group of United States senators has decided that it matters very much, and they have put their concerns into a formal piece of legislation that is moving through Congress right now. The problem is geography. Specifically, it is about where America's gold, silver, platinum, and palladium are actually stored. Most people assume that a market as massive and as important as the precious metals market would be spread out across the country, with vaults in different states, different regions, and different cities. That assumption would be wrong. In reality, nearly all of the exchange-approved depositories for these metals sit within roughly 180 miles of New York City. That is the entire footprint. One metropolitan region holds the physical backbone of a market that helps set prices for gold and silver around the world. This is not a small detail. It is the kind of structural weakness that engineers call a single point of failure. In simple terms, that means if something disrupts that one region, it does not just create a local problem, it creates a national one and possibly a global one. A natural disaster, a major storm, an extended power failure, a cyber attack, or any other serious disruption in that area could suddenly make it very difficult to access, move, or settle trades involving these metals. The senators behind this new legislation are not raising this issue as a theory. They are raising it as a real and present risk to financial stability. What makes this especially significant is the language being used. This is not being framed as a business inconvenience or a minor regulatory issue. It is being described as a matter of national security. That phrase carries weight in Washington. It means lawmakers see this as something that could affect the country's broader financial system, not just the metals industry. When senators from both political parties agree to put their names on a bill using that kind of language, it signals that the concern is shared, serious, and no longer something that can be quietly dismissed. To understand why this concentration happened in the first place, it helps to look back several decades. Many of the rules that created this system date back to the 1970s. At the time, those rules made sense for the market as it existed then, but markets change, technology changes, and risks change. What was once a reasonable structure has become, in the eyes of many experts and now lawmakers, an outdated policy that leaves the entire system exposed. The rules essentially locked out depositories located outside of the New York region from participating in publicly traded markets in any meaningful way. Over time, this created exactly the kind of concentration that worries security analysts today. It is worth pausing here to consider why this matters beyond Wall Street and government offices. Precious metals are not just investment products. They play a critical role in defense technology, aerospace manufacturing, electronics, medical equipment, and energy production. When silver and gold supply chains face risk, it is not only investors who feel the impact. Entire industries that depend on these materials could face disruption as well. This is part of why the issue has drawn attention, not just from financial regulators, but from policymakers focused on national security and supply chain resilience. For the average person watching from outside this world, there is a simple lesson hiding inside this complicated policy debate. It is the same lesson that has applied to wealth and security for centuries. Do not put everything in one place. Whether someone is a central bank, a national government, or an individual trying to protect their own savings, concentration creates risk, and diversification reduces it. The senators behind this bill clearly understand that principle, and they are now trying to apply it at the level of national infrastructure. What happens next will determine whether this remains a quiet policy discussion inside Congress, or whether it becomes a much larger conversation about how seriously the United States protects one of its most valuable and sensitive markets. The next part of this story looks closely at exactly how this legislation came together, who was behind it, and why regulators were already paying close attention before a single bill was even introduced. To understand why this issue has moved from quiet industry conversation to formal legislation, it helps to look at exactly who is behind it and how it came together. This was not a sudden idea. It was the result of years of growing concern that finally reached a tipping point inside the halls of Congress. The bill at the center of this story carries two formal numbers, SB 4621 in the Senate and HR 807 in the House. It is known informally as the Silver Act, though its scope reaches well beyond silver alone. It was introduced by an unlikely pairing in today's political climate, a senator from Idaho and a senator from Nevada, representing different parties and very different constituencies. Yet, on this particular issue, they found common ground. That alone tells observers something important. When lawmakers from opposite ends of the political spectrum agree that a problem is serious enough to act on, it usually means the underlying data is difficult to argue with. This legislation did not appear in isolation. It is being advanced as part of a larger and more powerful piece of legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2027. Attaching it to defense authorization is a significant strategic move. The National Defense Authorization Act is one of the most closely watched and reliably passed bills in Congress every year, because it funds military operations and national security priorities. By folding this precious metals concentration issue into that larger bill, lawmakers are signaling that they view it as a genuine national security matter, not simply a financial regulation update. Behind the scenes, this effort has the backing of a wide and diverse coalition. Mints, refineries, depositories, dealers, miners, banks, logistics companies, and risk management firms have all voiced support. This is notable because these groups do not always agree with one another on industry policy. Their shared support suggests a rare moment of alignment across an entire supply chain, all pointing toward the same underlying concern that the current system is too fragile and too concentrated to remain unaddressed. Regulators were already paying attention before this bill was formally introduced. Earlier this year, the chairman of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission publicly welcomed the introduction of the Silver Act on the House side and offered to work directly with Congress to refine it. This is a meaningful detail. Regulatory agencies do not typically rush to endorse pending legislation unless they already share serious concerns about the underlying issue. His public support suggests that federal regulators had been quietly tracking this vulnerability for some time, waiting for lawmakers to take the lead. Part of why this matters so much comes down to a specific legal designation. The primary exchange where these precious metals depositories operate has been designated by the Treasury Department's Financial Stability Oversight Council as a systemically important financial market utility. That designation is not handed out casually. It is reserved for institutions considered critical to the overall stability of the United States financial system. Entities with this designation receive certain government privileges, including access to emergency liquidity support during a crisis. But those privileges come paired with heightened responsibility and oversight. This connects directly to a section of the Dodd-Frank Act, passed after the 2008 financial crisis, which created a framework specifically designed to reduce concentration, operational, and liquidity risks within these systemically important institutions. In other words, the very law created to prevent another financial crisis is now being used as the justification for fixing this geographic concentration problem. Lawmakers are essentially arguing that the current depository system works against the spirit of that post-crisis safeguard rather than supporting it. What makes this story particularly compelling is the contrast with how other commodity markets operate. Other major commodities are deliberately spread across multiple regions of the country for storage and settlement, specifically to avoid this kind of concentrated risk. Precious metals are the exception, still operating under decades-old rules that never accounted for the risks the modern financial system faces today. The contrast is becoming harder for policymakers to ignore. Taken together, these details paint a clear picture. This is not a fringe idea pushed by a small number of activists. It is a coordinated effort involving elected officials from both parties, a powerful industry coalition, and federal regulators who appear ready to support meaningful change. The next part of this story examines exactly what could happen if this risk is left unaddressed, and what history and basic financial logic suggest should happen instead. Every piece of legislation tells two stories. There is the immediate story, the specific problem it claims to solve, and there is the deeper story, what it reveals about how those in power are starting to think. With this bill, both stories matter, and the second one may turn out to be more significant than the first. On the surface, this legislation is straightforward. It does not force the approval of any specific new depository location. Instead, it creates a clearer application process, stronger transparency requirements, and more objective standards for evaluating where precious metals can be stored and settled. The goal is to open the door for qualified depositories across different regions of the country, rather than keeping the system locked around one area by outdated rule. This alone would represent meaningful progress, reducing concentration risk while encouraging more competition and potentially lowering costs across the industry. But the deeper story is what makes this worth paying close attention to. Once lawmakers begin treating precious metal storage as a matter of national security rather than a routine financial detail, the conversation rarely stays contained. Issues like this tend to expand once they receive serious institutional attention. A coalition representing the industry has already gone further than the bill itself, stating in formal communication to Congress that this is not only about risk exposure, it is also about market liquidity, fair competition, and the ability to build stronger supply chain infrastructure outside of one narrow region. That is a broader argument than the bill's text alone suggests, and it hints at where this conversation may be heading next. This is where the story becomes especially relevant for anyone paying close attention to gold as a strategic asset. If Congress is willing to scrutinize private exchange depositories this closely, a natural and uncomfortable question follows. What about the government's own gold reserves? For decades, those reserves have existed largely outside of public scrutiny, audited only in limited and infrequent ways. A large portion of that gold has a complicated history, tied to a period in the 1930s when private gold ownership was restricted and citizens were required to exchange their holdings. Much of what remains in official reserves today traces back to that era. If lawmakers are now applying this kind of national security reasoning to private industry storage practices, it raises the possibility, even if not the certainty, that similar reasoning could eventually be applied to official reserves as well. Would the same standards of transparency, geographic diversification, and security review apply there too? That question has not been formally raised inside this legislation, but the logic behind the bill makes it a reasonable one to ask. What this ultimately signals is a shift in how seriously Washington is beginning to treat precious metals, not as a niche commodity market, but as a piece of strategic financial infrastructure tied directly to national resilience. Whether or not this particular bill passes in its current form, the underlying recognition behind it is unlikely to disappear. Once national security language becomes attached to an issue, it tends to remain part of the conversation for years to come. For business leaders, investors, and anyone serious about understanding where financial risk is heading next, this story offers an early signal worth remembering. The institutions responsible for safeguarding national wealth are beginning to ask the same questions that careful individuals have asked about their own wealth for a long time. Where exactly is it being held? How exposed is it? And what happens the day something goes wrong? That question is no longer confined to personal finance. It has now reached the floor of the United States Senate. Understanding a policy problem on paper is one thing. Understanding what it actually means in practice is another. To grasp why lawmakers are treating this issue with such urgency, it helps to walk through what could genuinely happen if this concentration risk is ever tested in the real world. Picture a market where almost all of the physical gold, silver, platinum, and palladium that backs official exchange trading sits in vaults clustered within a single geographic region. Now picture a disruption hitting that region. It does not need to be a dramatic, catastrophic event. It could be something far more ordinary. A severe winter storm that knocks out power for an extended period, a major flood that damages infrastructure, a prolonged outage affecting transportation or communication networks. Any of these could suddenly make it difficult to access, verify, or move physical metal in or out of those vaults. Now scale that disruption up. Consider a deliberate cyber attack targeting financial infrastructure, or a coordinated act designed to disrupt critical systems. These are not far-fetched scenarios in the modern threat environment. National security analysts plan for them constantly, precisely because adversaries understand that disrupting financial infrastructure can be as damaging as disrupting physical infrastructure. If the systems responsible for verifying and settling precious metals, trades are concentrated in one place, an attacker would only need to succeed in one location to cause nationwide consequences. This is the heart of what analysts mean when they describe this as a single point of failure. It is not just about losing access to physical metal sitting in a vault. It is about what happens to the broader market that depends on that vault functioning normally. Price discovery, the process by which markets determine what gold and silver are actually worth at any given moment, depends on trading and settlement happening smoothly. If that process is interrupted, the effects do not stay contained to one region. They ripple outward into global markets that rely on those prices as a benchmark. This is precisely why the legislation frames the issue as a matter of national security rather than simply an industry inconvenience. A market disruption of this kind would not just affect institutional traders or large financial firms. It could affect supply chains for industries that depend on these metals for manufacturing, defense technology, electronics, and medical equipment. It could also affect public confidence in the broader financial system at a moment when that confidence may already be fragile. There's an old and simple piece of wisdom that applies directly to this situation, one that has guided prudent decision-making for centuries. Do not store everything of value in a single location. This principle did not originate with modern finance. It has been understood by merchants, traders, and households for generations, long before centralized markets or electronic trading existed. What is happening in Washington right now is essentially an institutional version of that same lesson. Lawmakers are recognizing, perhaps later than they should have, that concentrating something this valuable and this important in one narrow region creates exactly the kind of vulnerability that careful planning is supposed to prevent. This lesson does not only apply to national infrastructure. It applies just as directly to individuals and businesses making decisions about their own wealth. Anyone holding meaningful value in a single account, a single location, or relying entirely on a single institution is, in a smaller way, exposed to the same kind of risk that lawmakers are now trying to correct at the national level. The logic is identical, even if the scale is different. This is what makes the current legislative effort more than just a regulatory footnote. It reflects a basic truth about risk that applies at every level, from a national financial system down to an individual household. The next part of this story looks at what this growing awareness could mean for the future of precious metals oversight, and why some analysts believe it may open the door to much closer scrutiny of how America's own gold reserves are managed.